Hey folks, this is Dr. Van Breeding. Mountain Comprehensive Health Corporation's vision of healthcare was designed to serve your entire family, and our mission starts at birth. No one knows that better than us with the delivery of thousands of babies over the years. MCHC has put together the best providers and medical staff possible because we know a healthy family is a happy family. Schedule a preventative checkup today at your nearest MCHC clinic.
MCHC.
Providing better health for a longer life.
You know the drill with Wes Smith. Wes Smith, presented by MCHC.
You know the drill, sponsored by MCHC, providing better health for a longer life. Brady, MCHC's warmed me out this week. I feel like I've done meetings with them and I've been on the road, and I'm kind of glad to be back in the office for a minute.
They have. I mean, every time I talk to you, you're in some other city and putting miles on the car.
Between UK Healthcare and MCHC, I'm man, I need if I got paid for mileage, it would be dangerous.
What would you request? 60 cents a mile? 75 cents a mile?
At least. At least.
Got to get that electric car, Blue. Get that electric car.
Oh, man, Brady, I'm excited for today. We always talk about our guests that we have on here, and I love, how 99% of our guests I have a connection to, and that's why I want to bring them on the show and talk, and you have a connection to, and that's why you want to bring them on the show to talk. The guest today is actually kind of funny because me and you were talking earlier, and you said, so how do you really know him? And I was like, well, I don't really know him, but I had a great relationship with his dad. And so I'd actually reached out to his dad, and his dad had kind of told me reach out to him. So I'm super excited to have our guest on here today. One, because of that personal connection I have with his dad. Two, because this guy does a job that I'm so envious of. And I'm sure it's tough. I'm sure it's difficult. But man, some of the things that we've already talked about pre-show, I'm like, I was already excited, and now I'm geeked out.
Yeah, I don't even know. Whatever is above geeked. I'm excited for our listeners to hear some stories of one of your heroes, and whatever is geeked X times 10, I think is what you're at right now. Excited to hear what he has to share.
So our guest today, and you can correct me if I'm wrong once I dive into this, but senior writer for Sports Illustrated, has covered every kind of sport you can imagine quite some time. Written for some other organizations prior to Sports Illustrated, but has co-authored at least 2 books that I've heard about and read about, and has actually won some sports Emmys over the years for some productions that he has done. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to You Know the Drill, senior writer for Sports Illustrated, Greg Bishop. Greg, thank you, man. Thank you so much for making this happen and hopping on here with us.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate the introduction. I'm going to tell my agents they need to get on the ball because I think that was better than anything they're selling out there. Yeah, no, it was really cool to hear from you over Twitter DM. I'm pleased to hear that my father is not randomly giving out my number because I decline most of these. I like to talk about my work because it's on my brain when possible. But when I saw that DM before the Super Bowl, I was psyched to come on. So thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I had your dad as a professor. A lot of the guests that I have on this show, Greg, as well as Brady, my co-host, and some other people, are always so astounded by the connections that I've made through Alice Lloyd College throughout the years. This little small private liberal arts college in southeastern Kentucky. And this is another one of those instances where I had your dad as a professor there. You kind of laughed earlier when I said it. We always called him Dr. B, right? I called him Dr. B. And man, he was one of those professors I had that you could just be real with. I loved outside of the classroom, just sitting and talking to him in his office and other places. And it was just a great time. So man, you got a great dad and definitely somebody that I've looked up to through my life since I've known him.
I love that. Can I ask a question on here? What was he like as a professor? I would love to hear a little more of that.
Man, it was great. Honestly, like, I had him I was an education major going through college at the start, and I ended up obviously dropping that and becoming a history major. But I had him in my education classes, and he was one of those guys that made it, you felt like when you went into the classroom, you were actually going to have a learning that was real and fundamental as far as what you're going to experience. He talked to you like, not like he was an actual professor to you, but he talked to you like he was someone that was giving you true advice and helping you out. So uh, he was funny. He would always crack some jokes in there, and you could crack some jokes back with him. So, man, you missed out. I wish you could have been through some of those classes with your dad. It was amazing.
It's really awesome. And the reason I laughed when you said that is maybe interesting. Like he spent so many years getting that doctorate. And I remember much of my teenage years were spent watching him take classes online, but back when we had a dial-up modem. I'm dating myself here. But
Remember those well, Greg.
It's cool that the students were able to recognize that. I'm sure it meant more to him than you knew.
That's amazing. And I'm speaking for myself, but I can tell you that I know there were several others that went through that program with me that still probably communicate with him. I always like to kind of keep up with him on Facebook and check in with him from time to time. But man, I'm so glad that I had him, and he's connected with you here through that, and it's going to be awesome. I'm excited about our conversation today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah. So, Greg, one of the first things that we usually do on this podcast is kind of dive into who we're talking to, our guest of the day, and to highlight you. So obviously, very successful in your career choice. What got that started, man? At what point in your life did you kind of realize that I'm going to be a sports writer or producer?
I'm going to out myself as a massive, massive nerd here, but I knew pretty early. And the cool part about this podcast, among many, many hundreds that I've done appearances on, is that it really did start with my dad. Like, I'm not fashioning an answer to make that tie. My dad was a high school football coach and assistant at Washington High School in Parkland, Washington, which is down south of Seattle near Tacoma. He had one NFL player. He coached the linebackers. One NFL player, Lewis Bush, that was on the Chargers 1995 title team. He's actually one of that team had a rare amount of deaths of people at early ages, and he's one that passed away early. And then I also remember this guy, Kane Rogers, amazing running back, great safety, returned kicks and punts. And those two have stuck in my mind all this time. But I spent a lot of time around my dad watching football tape, which I'm sure happens to a lot of people that actually play football, but I'm not sure for many people that have my lack of athleticism, they can get turned on to the game that way. My dad also read the Tacoma News Tribune every morning. And because I am probably the biggest nerd in the world, I used to read the sports section every day before school. You're talking John Clayton was there at the time. May he rest in peace. Mike Kahn, NBA insider nationally, also may he rest in peace, was there. Bart Wright, an amazing columnist. And I think those two things spurred me a desire to see if I could do something like this. Now, I had zero idea of how to go about any of it, but I'm also the kind of weirdo that wrote a paper in ninth grade about wanting to work for the New York Times.
Wow.
And at the same time, I was hanging SI covers all over my room, and they weren't like swimsuit editions. I wish I could say that because people always kind of look back at me. I hung up the writers. Like,
yeah,
I knew Scott Price and came to work with them. I knew Dr. Z. Like, I was in love with those two places and feel extremely fortunate to have worked for both. But if my dad hadn't pointed me toward reading, toward study, and toward academics was his life in all forms of the work he did, I don't think we'd be sitting here having this conversation. So thanks, Pops.
That's amazing.
Did you always want to be the writer? Like, or was there other parts of the media that well, I guess, again, I'm not trying to date you, but like, I guess back in the day when you started this, I guess, media, which we can get into later, like the media back in the day, again, was primarily paper and writing. There wasn't the social media stuff. So like, was writing all on your mind, or were you looking to be on TV or anything like that?
I'll give you a couple anecdotes that I think help answer that because your question is astute and spot on. One is my first internship was at the Washington Times in 2000. I worked on the Metro desk. That's a Mooney Republican paper. So as you can imagine, it was a pretty interesting summer. And we had one computer with internet for the entire Metro section. I would also say that I was among the first students in my high school to have access to a cell phone, and it was my dad's, and it was like about this big, and I believe it had 20 minutes a month. And if
Oh,
you
yeah.
went over that, they really charged you a lot. All of which is to say that your instinct on the question is correct. Like, I went into this wanting to be a print journalist. I wasn't like opposed to doing TV. I still do a lot of it. I've never once felt comfortable doing it, but you know, it's part of the job. I had a professor in college, Lou Marciano at Syracuse, who was the like third or fourth in charge of the university, but he taught this particular class. I can't even remember which one. And he told me, this one still stings, but the accuracy is fair, that I have a face for radio. So that discouraged me from other mediums. Now, the evolution of journalism as an industry is what changed my mind on some of this stuff. You know, starting around, I'd say 2018, it became clear SI was heading in the direction that we've headed. I mean that without disrespect. Everybody's dealing with all this stuff, and it's not my job to fix those things. So that said, like these things kind of came to me naturally. Like I covered a lot of boxing. I believe I'm the last boxing writer from the New York Times that they had on staff. Um, and that led to Showtime asking me if I wanted to do TV scripts. So I worked on the show All Access for, 6 years until Showtime died. In the process of that, I met a lot of producers, a lot of executive directors, etc. Now I have a small documentary company with a guy whose book I did, Jim Gray. We just sold a Tyson doc to Netflix. So all these things happen organically. I was telling you guys earlier, I'm currently working on a museum that'll be at the Fontainebleau, Las Vegas. That's Jim Gray and Tom Brady and Fran Gray, Jim's wife, are kind of spearheading that. I'm basically the guy on the side of the freeway now with the cardboard sign, but it says "Will write for food," and I'll do anything. I've written voiceovers for travel insurance companies. I've written speeches for athletes I can't name. I've written anything that can be written in any form. And what I've found, I guess, is print dies a slow, painful death, and I become another version of a Blockbuster video clerk. I've found that I actually like the other mediums more because they're different. Like I've had a lot of covers. I know how that sounds, but it's just seeing this stuff in a museum is gonna, be way more impactful than however many I might have left.
Well, I gotta, when I always used to write, again, I was horrible at it and still am, but was how do you,
Why you're on the podcast?
yeah. Which, how do you start? Like when you got to just write that first sentence and then get the flow. What's your like, how do you get going with this? Because you can sit there and twirl your fingers and you're like going nowhere. Like, do you just get in a rhythm, put on some music and rock?
Well, I would say that process has evolved over time. It's a great question. Like when I was younger, I think what had settled in my brain was the idea that a writer who did meaningful work was tortured. So I would sit at my laptop and stare at every sentence and take smoke breaks and like all these things that like I thought were helping me reach my full writerly potential, which even saying that sounds remarkably stupid, right? And then I think I just realized over time, like this isn't helping me. I used to transcribe every interview I had, and it was like I want to be familiar with the material. Then I realized if I read it once, I was just as familiar, and I could pay college kids in Syracuse to do it for a fraction of the headache, which gave me about 7 more magazine stories a year. And as you're hearing me say this, you could probably pick up on process became incredibly important to me. And so one thing I'm trying to do now when I'm in the end stages of my print career, maybe, or maybe the end of the middle. I guess we'll see what happens. I think what I'm trying to do is primarily write in the way that feels best that day. So most times I do put on some music and I just try to put down words. I know they're not good. I know I'll come back to them, but I try not to hang that process up. Other days I feel like, man, I just want to write something that is good, that I don't feel terrible about. I think most writers hate most of their own writing, even after it's published, and that's definitely true for me. So I'll say I'm going to give, 3 hours to 500 words here and really polish it up just so I remind my inner subconscious that I can do this. And I think because of that, I've ended up, right now I have 9 employers. I recently had 11, but I just finished 2 books for Freddie Roach, the boxing trainer. And I think most of my day is divided into like 30-minute increments. So I've actually in my career been drawn to stories about process because I was ultimately figuring out my own. And so today it was a lot of museum work, but mixed into there, I'm moderating a panel at South by Southwest in a couple weeks. So after we get off this call, I got to get the questions ready for the panelists. And, there will be other SI work. I have an investigation I'm doing right now. And anyway, long way to answer your question, but I would say shakily and usually sadly, like there's just no way around it. That part is hard. It
So
will never not be.
I'm just thinking, right? Like you hear those stories of like surgeons, they put on that Metallica and go to work. I'm just picturing you right now throwing on some like Linkin Park and like rallying and writing up. And I'm just like, that's where my head went. But that's amazing. I love that.
Well, interesting and nerdy answer to that, what you just said. Like, I am working now on cadence. Like, I look for ways I can improve my writing now that I understand structure and character development and things they don't teach you even at the New York Times, for instance. Now I'm working on like cadence, like a lot of music depending on the how fast it's said or sung, depending on the inflection points, for me kind of evokes feeling. And so I'm trying to marry when I feel a certain way listening to something, can I make that come alive on a page? To me, that would evoke more feeling in the written word, which is often what people say is absent there. And I would disagree, but not in most instances. And so yeah, I play a lot of, I mean, I'm a 90s kid who grew up in Tacoma, Washington, near Seattle. So I play a lot of 90s rap and, I shout it in here. I'm sure my neighbors are like, what's wrong with this guy? I play a lot of grunge. I was obviously big into, Mudhoney and Nirvana and all that stuff back then. And then I play songs like during the Super Bowl, like this year, the story I wrote about the Eagles to capture their championship was like primarily based in self-help and these like small concessions each had made to get along better, which is all they needed to win. And so I'm not even lying here. I am embarrassed to say this, but like parts that were sad, I put on like new Justin Bieber, which I like hated Biebs. I hated Biebs, but if you listen to like Justice, I mean that's elite writing, And my friend told me this and I resisted it for months. And then I listened to it. I said, "Hold, like every note he's hitting is like perfect. The inflection's perfect. The pacing's perfect." And I'm like, "Do I love Biebs now? I can't. What? Like." Anyway, so I would put that on and see if I could get a similar cadence in my work. I don't know. You can tell me how well I did, but it's like that level of this is like to me less of a job and more of a craft. And I've become comfortable over the years with being maybe the nerdiest of all the nerds.
That's kind of, I'm amazed right now at just the connection to the music. Even if it does make you a believer, that's fine, whatever.
That's it right there.
Yeah.
Yep. I am not gonna lie to you guys and say that's untrue. I have come around.
There we go. That's an aspect of writing I'd never thought about. And, my ADHD self, I feel like I have to have something going on in the background or I never get anything on paper. But that's, you also said it makes me feel really good. And I feel like a lot of young aspiring writers love to hear that. That's not me. I'm not a young aspiring writer. But however, I've always been like that to where, I write something and I get in the groove. And while I'm writing and typing it feels great. Right. And then you get done and you read it and you're like, holy, that's terrible. Like, and you just want to start. So knowing that even the professionals that do it for a living feel that way about some of their work is kind of reassuring, right?
I'd say even that it's worse than that. Like what you do as you do that process over and over and over again, especially if you have a pinch of success along the way, people are telling you that it's good, that they haven't read something like that, whatever. All this stuff I try to forget the minute somebody says it to me. What you do is you imprint that fear in your subconscious. So now it's there and it's never going to go away. And I would tell you guys today, since we're doing true confessions of a hack on this podcast as well, I would tell you today that any writer who tells you they're not tortured internally, who thinks their writing is perfect, who just believes that they know how to do this is lying. I don't believe a single one of them.
That's amazing. Well, I have to add, you, even though you feel that way about your writing, I feel like there's always pieces that you maybe feel a little bit closer to throughout your career, whether it's been a documentary or an article. Is there any of your pieces that have hung with you where even maybe you don't think it's great that you feel more of a connection to than others?
Yeah, I could probably give you 100 examples, but I think the ones that stand out, like, you mentioned your ADHD. I'm obviously extremely that way. I think I scored an 81 out of 82 on the assessment. I don't know if you knew this about my dad, but he and I are both dyslexic. I'm like Noah Lyles beyond the keyboard. And basically, I think within that, you have to be able to sort of figure out a path forward, which has led me to all these sort of process chunks, dividing my day up a lot, having things going on in the background, a lot of multitasking. So, yeah, I think the stories that stay with me are the ones that help me understand myself. And around 2017, before my life took a sharp turn into, some pretty tenuous events that I'm still dealing with, but getting there, I wrote what I think is like the first big story on mental health in college sports. It was about Tyler Helinski and his family and the work they're doing. It was only 6 months after he died by suicide. I remember going to their house in Orange County, and the first interview because we did a documentary at SI with the story was 6 hours long, and I had to bite my lips so much to prevent myself from crying that it bled for like 2 weeks. And I think that story was memorable. I was super happy with it, which, as I just said, doesn't happen a lot. But the Linskys have become kind of like a fifth or sixth set of parents for me. Like I've had some of those in college, etc. When I have a mental health question, I talk to them. I check in with them regularly. I haven't written about them in a while now, but I did several magazine pieces on them that I think were deeper because of that relationship, which is maybe not what they would teach you to do in journalism school. But I think the concept of objectivity and what I do is changing anyway. And, one time more recently, I went with them to do one of their talks. They call them Tyler Talks, named after him. They give hundreds every year for their foundation, Helinski's Hope, if anyone wants to check it out. And I went to Utah State with them where I watched them interact with kids. There was a kid in the audience who shot himself in the chest and survived and come to Utah State because his brother was there to support him. There was another who hadn't told his coach until after they talked that he was considering taking his own life. He'd lost the baby during stillbirth and didn't know how to handle it. And he went up to the coach afterward to tell him. And like, I just think I do a lot of recreating in my job, whether it's scenes or anecdotes or whatever. And the depth and power of that really stayed with me in a way that has been really practically applicable to my own life. So I could give a ton of them, but the other corollary is now I'm writing a lot of stories about people in middle age trying to hang on to dream jobs that are changing. I wonder why.
Well, it's wild to think, when I feel like for someone outside of the profession, like me for myself, when I think sports writer, you almost are drawn to the highs. You think about the highs, right? You think about the Super Bowls, you think about the NCAA championships. What doesn't come to mind always is some of those points, the lower points in people's lives that impact not only you, but them as well when you write about it. So it's kind of amazing to hear and be reminded that it's not all, it's not always the highs.
100%. And I try to make some of my job like that specifically. I did it, I think, subconsciously at first. But, for instance, I pursued Cole Madison for a story for years. I never got him to agree. He was Tyler's right tackle. The offensive linemen were with Tyler when he stole an AR-15 semi-automatic rifle from them, which is what he used in the closet to end his life. And, the idea was like, how can I do mental health differently? Because I've written so many stories I could Mad Libs it in terms of they don't know why and they're trying to figure it out. And it led to this, sort of effort, none of which are bad at all. But I realized a couple of years ago, I was kind of creatively in a rut. And one of the ways I decided to change that was by looking at stuff. For me, Cole Madison represented something I still want to do in some way, which is that mental health is entirely an uneven exercise, that because you feel good one day, you're not necessarily going to stay that way. And Cole went to the NFL and missed seasons with the Packers because he couldn't deal with the aftermath, which I think is really a brave thing, not the opposite. Like to step away from this job that everybody you ever know wanted and that you yourself have wanted your whole life because that right now it's not healthy for you. Like that's exactly the impact I'm trying to help the Helinskis have. And so, I did a piece on Cam Jordan this season for the Saints where I followed him through the whole year. And I wasn't sure like why I did that. Now I know, like he's 36, I'm 45, not dissimilar, especially NFL dog years in play. And, he's at the end of this thing, and it was going to be his final season. I wanted to capture that. He ended up deciding to come back. And ended up capturing the debating that he's doing internally. And I just think I'm really, really lucky to be able to figure out my own life and meet these people and get paid for it.
Yeah, absolutely. So you probably got to spend some time around. We had a guest I guess it's been several weeks ago now from the Saints, Landon Young. So you probably got to be around Landon Young a little bit as well during that coverage.
Yeah, he might even have been on for the last home game in the Superdome, which is probably Cam's last home game there. But I went out to New Orleans and we did a Polar Express ride on the Friday before that game. There were a few players, some of whom I didn't recognize. All their families were there, like on an actual train that goes back and forth and recreates the story.
Yeah.
Possible he was even there.
Wow. Wow. Well, Greg, I feel like in this profession, I know in ours as well, covering sports, you always, before you get into it and when you're younger, you look at a lot of these athletes and you look at them as, larger than life, right? And they seem like superheroes to you. And there comes a point to where you start realizing these are people just like me, everything else. But still, after that point, there's always that one person that you realize you're going to get to interview or you're going to get to spend some time with that you're like, I can't believe I'm doing this right now. I can't believe I'm going to be around this person. You already mentioned one for me earlier with the working on the museum with Tom Brady. So we're going to get to that in a minute. But has there been maybe somebody that to you, obviously some of the people you've worked with are very prestigious, but has there been anyone that you're like leading up to that you're like, wow, I can't believe I'm actually getting ready to have this opportunity to work with this person?
Yeah, I would say tons of them. And what's cool about it is they tend to happen naturally, and part of that is like what they would teach you on the first day of any journalism school worth anything is that you have to be objective and you can't and to me that's a false construct to begin with. Like I want to be objective in terms of the facts, like not cut people breaks when they're trying to massage them. I'm not a PR arm. But in terms of like getting access to people like this, one, it's really hard. Two, the biggest, most important thing for me when I profile somebody is showing them that I'm a real human being so that I can get to their real human being. Without that, I don't have any depth to any of these stories that I've done. And so over the years, naturally, you just kind of gravitate to some people. I love this question because I always think it's a little different than people think, right? Like, it doesn't really matter to me how famous they are. My friends kill me all the time for name dropping, but this is just the people I'm interacting with, is what I would say, although that fair, okay? And I think, these things happen naturally. A couple people come to mind. I wrote a lot of Seahawks because I'm local here. I live outside Seattle when they were on the Legion of Boom run. End up becoming really close with Michael Bennett, really close with Doug Baldwin, still keep in touch with both those guys, unrelated to my day-to-day job. Dak Prescott's a guy who, like, we talked a lot about mental health. I did a cover story on him a few years ago, the year after his leg snapped, on TV. And he ended up changing his mind about the premise of the story based on like our discussions. And Him and I still share podcasts and books and stuff like that, which is weird, right? Like, but also I don't want to take an authentic relationship and make it bad because I'm supposed to. Michaela Schifrin comes to mind as well. Like, she's a famous ski racer, just won her 100th race. Nobody ever cracked triple digits ever before in her sport. She calls me her therapist, and for that I must thank my therapist. But these things all, like, they end up working like that, and I'm consistently surprised. At this point, the only leverage I have left to pitch people at SI is the cover. There's only 13 of those. When I started in early 2014, there were 72. And so, I really have to pitch my own work or my own relationships. And what I've discovered as I get older and older and older is that I've really liked going back to people because the depth there is incredible. And, whenever we get to the Eagles piece, if we do, Jalen Hurts is a perfect example of that.
I think, sitting here thinking, maybe I would love to see me and Brady ski racing. You talked about her winning 100th race. We could probably turn this into a comedy podcast.
We could.
Put us on.
Well, what's funny? Michaela and I are cool enough where last time we were interviewing for something that I did on her, she mentioned how she, like, really tries to figure out what the hardest sport to do is, and I was pushing back that golf is, but that's probably just because I'm a sucky golfer. And she was saying, like, she had heard it from an Indy driver, and so she was, like, considering the parameters. One of my documentary pitch ideas, trademark, is to explore the hardest sport in sports with her as the host, trying them all. And so nobody's picked up on that one yet, but if anybody likes that out there, you know where to find me. And, it's a good example of what you're talking about. To me, I think that innocuous comment by her led to a really cool idea. And none of it would be possible if it's just, some guys are like, show up, do your interview, and leave. Pat Mahomes is like that with me. We're not friendly outside of that, but I don't need friendly outside of that. I just won't turn it down if it leads to something else.
Well, I think I would say hitting a baseball. If you had to guess, we could do a little Olympics. Me and Wes could test all this out for you if you want. But
I like
hitting a 95-mile-an-hour fastball or like a curve, no shot for me.
Well, and, like, I buy that logic, but I'd say, like, look at how many variables are in ski racing. Like, you make one tiny mistake because of weather, course conditions, where you are in the lineup, what you see while going 90 miles an hour down a mountain. Like, one mistake can lead to, like, death. Like,
that's true.
And
it is a life death thing.
And then I also think of golf, like, there's 100 variables in every swing, which is why I suck at golf. I think
you're not alone in that race, Greg. I can promise you that.
Greg, one thing I want to hit on, because my mind is all over the place. And how do you go about thinking of stories? Like, are you give someone like me and Wes don't know this, and our viewers or listeners are probably wanting the same thing. Like, you obviously have a boss, and your employers. Are they directing you on kind of where to go fish for these stories, or is this kind of your natural mind, like, seeking these out?
Kind of a long answer. Great question, in part because it's changed over time. When I first came out of college, my jobs at the Seattle Times were 25 high schools north of Seattle. So nobody's assigning anything on those. Like, you have to talk to every coach to get stories, which was great training for what I do now. And then, I was young, so mostly assigned. But the majority of my career, I would say I've had, let's say 90% of the stuff I've written has come from my own brain, for better and for worse. And I think the benefit to that is cool is, like, now intellectual property is more important than any word I can write. So I'm able to take a huge list of ideas that I used to just sit there with me begging my editors to approve me doing them. And now ones they turn down, I can take elsewhere and do in other forms. Along the way there, I taught myself to think in story, which makes me incredibly obnoxious to anyone I'm around who doesn't care about my work, which is quite a few people, actually. And so, I use this example. Maybe it's too gross, but if it is, you can, Anyway, I use this example, like, anywhere I go, I'm thinking in story. I read 3 hours a day because I write TV voiceover. I've watched every sports show on demand, including each on Netflix. I'm currently writing voiceover for Morgan Freeman for the museum. God. But I can't go to the doctors or the bar or anywhere in the world without thinking like, that's interesting. How would I write that? That's always kind of the question that bubbles up. God, I am really outing myself.
That's cool though, because like I mean, it's I think a really hard thing that you've really figured out from your process is how do you channel it all? Because I don't know how many times we've all been there. We've all been sitting at work one day or the other, and you just you don't even know, you have so much to do and you don't know where to start, and you just kind of like, you know what I mean? You get nothing accomplished. But I think what you're saying here is you throughout your ideas, you've developed this process to keep you on pace for all this, which is amazing because I haven't figured that part out.
Well, it's a very astute point, in part because, yeah, I think I used to be more like that. I'd have like an 8-page schedule of stuff I had to
Yeah.
do, but I'd often find myself drawn to that was easier. Anything I could kind of knock off to feel like I'd accomplished something, but then I'm putting off the hard stuff, which ended up keeping me up all night. I'd say, let's say 2017 to 20 to like a month ago, I was operating on about 2.5, 3 hours sleep a night to get all this done. That bill came due, and now we're getting Z's a lot earlier. But yeah, I think for me, what I wanted to do, like my parents are both educators. They did not see ADHD in me, which is kind of crazy to me in 2025, but maybe the times were different. I always thought of my brain and the way it works as more of a hindrance to what I do. And only when I started working in these other mediums and you realize nobody who works in television has a good original idea, which is why all you see is docuseries right now. They're not trained like we are to look for stories, to talk to people, to do things that are uncomfortable, even to the people that you're featuring, because there's a lot more to learn in those stories than there is from the ones that are primarily positive in nature. And I think I've really come to see my brain as like a weapon if I can stay out of my own way. And that's what's led to a lot more refinement of my process, which I'd say, I mean, it's crazy to say this to me, but I left the Times. I covered the Australian Open in 2013, was my last assignment at the New York Times. And I did not know how to outline a story when I left. And I taught myself narrative writing. I taught myself the form that we use at SI. I taught myself to perfect it. Then I taught myself to write VO and perfect it. Then I taught myself how to do everything else. And it's just like, I feel like if as long as I'm grounded in that, like tweaks, improvement, growth, then stuff like the Emmys and, to be fair to I have lost 6 in a row, so I'm kind of Jim Kellying over here, but don't worry, we'll break it soon. I just feel like it's an easy way to take focus off of outcomes. If I were going to worry about, say, my cover count now, which I actually don't know, I'd be going crazy because many guys, especially from 2000 to say 2022, had a lot more opportunities, right? We used to do 4 for every college football preview. That's an easy one to grab. Same for NFL. Now there's like 13 for real, 13. And I think last year I had 4. Like if I worry about that stuff, I'm going to go absolutely nuts. And I probably should just be driving for Uber instead,
But Greg, obviously you've done a lot of work in the field of football, and we cover a lot of football on this show. And it's actually one of the first ways I heard about you. I can remember sitting in Dr. B's office one time, and we were talking about the upcoming Super Bowl and all of this. And he was talking about how his son was going to be there covering the Super Bowl. And I was like, Dr. B, how do we not know about this yet? Tell us some more about this. So, but obviously you've covered a lot of Super Bowls and a lot of football events since the time, including this past Super Bowl in New Orleans. What's that experience like being on football's biggest stage, one of the biggest televised events of the year? Talk us a little bit through that Super Bowl coverage.
Well, I love what you said in part because that's really evolved for me too. My dad was a football coach. I was interested in football. I think because of the tape I watched with him and many, many hours spent playing Madden, I was schematically more aware than probably most people that were. I mean, I've been covering it, as part of my job since 2002. And so, I think covering the NFL is really hard. getting access to these guys is almost impossible. And if I were restarting, maybe I would have picked a different sport. But I do also feel like journalists, especially those in middle age like myself, need a specialty these days, or you're just so much easier to force out, and they try to force you out anyway. So I will give up the Super Bowl cover at Sports Illustrated when they pry it from my cold, dead hands. And because I'm old, I had to add up how many I've covered. 19 is the number, which is
19 Super Bowls.
every one since '06, which I did for the Seattle Times, and minus the Super Bowl where the Seahawks pummeled the Broncos in New York. I had 7 12s in my one bedroom apartment in Columbus Circle, but that was when I was switching from the NYT to SI, so I wasn't on any coverage for either one. And so those were fun Super Bowls. That's what it was like. I would go to Maxim Party, Playboy Party, EA Sports Party. I'd write a bunch of stories, but they were daily and they didn't have the heft. And then for the last 11 years, I've done the SI Super Bowl cover. And I always mention this, and I always add that I'm the only person on the earth who cares about this. But despite the many, many, many excellent, far better than me sports writers that have worked for Sports Illustrated, I'm currently second in the list that doesn't exist of Super Bowl cover stories. I'm only 2 away from Mike Silver, who has the most. And I saw him in New Orleans and said, I'm still coming for you. And he laughed and said, I hope you get there. So the process of doing this story is almost impossible. I have to report on both teams. We used to do that where I had 1 or 2 assistants back in the day, people that could help me make calls. As you can imagine, we used to put out like 200 interview requests and do more than 100 for this story. And that's partly because it was harder to get the teams to do what they did this year, which I'll get to. And so I'd have 2 people that I could say, pick up the phone from this person at 2 o'clock, ask these questions, they'd send it to me. I also had until after the game, until about 7 a.m. to write. So primarily for the first, let's say 8 of those, I wrote overnight after the Super Bowl, like 7,000 words, due at 7 a.m. And it was hard and fulfilling and really cool. Lately they've made that harder for me, which is just a function of where we are. When I started, we had 26 magazine editors, at least 1 or 2 digital people for every one of them. Now we have 2 magazine editors, and I'm not sure the exact total, but I think it's 8 of editors, period. Wow. And so they want both stories now by Friday, which means I'm writing a full story that will not exist. I was really, really happy with what I did on the Chiefs, but some of the stuff I cannot use. Like the deal is like only if you win. There's one thing in particular, the lead, that I have to save until they win again, if they ever do. And stuff like that comes up, right? Like there's one in the one I did on Tom Brady's Super Bowl with the Bucks, where it's him and Didier Drogba, the soccer player, this anecdote, and they're on the field at the Monaco Grand Prix after Brady has won 4, and he reveals his true motivation at that point. Like it wasn't to separate from Belichick, it wasn't even to have the most Super Bowls in NFL history. It was 7. He told Drogba, and they bet, like how long it would take, that he wanted to beat Jordan. Like that was the barometer for him that mattered. And I had to sit on that anecdote for 3 years until the next time I talked to Tom, because those cell phones are like bat phones, right? Like break glass in case of emergency. If I hit him too often, he's never going to respond to me again. And so I waited 3 years and I asked him about it, got it confirmed. And then it was in that Super Bowl cover story. And so a lot of this is like organizational too. I've talked with my book agent about doing a book of alternate history. He doesn't think there's enough. I disagree. Because each year I could write what I would have written if that team had won. And the joke at the SI offices, because it's true until this year really, is that every time I had better material on one team, they lost. And so this year was the first year where like both teams understood my process. I'd done it with both. And so I only made 4 calls this year, which felt pretty cool and pretty like aging, because I got both quarterbacks. I got Barkley. I got both coaches, both GMs, both owners. Like at that point, if you're doing a good interview, you don't need anybody. And so this is the first time in all 11 I've done where I felt really, really good about both stories. There's other ones, like I had as good a material in the Rams one from a few years ago, but I also couldn't get it wrestled down by 7 a.m. So you have a few that you lament, just like the players involved. I never thought of it that way.
Yeah, yeah.
So I guess I mean, that could go on for hours talking about just that whole little spiel, but I guess as we're all going to sleep after the Super Bowl, you're just getting started, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, yeah, we had a whole process for that too. Like Ben Baskin is the guy that did the most with me. He's the best young journalist I've mentored, and I currently work with probably 50 of them. And he gets me. He's a better editor than any of the editors I had there. He still edits all my stuff, even though he's like 2 jobs removed from SI. And one of his tasks during the week, and I gave him a byline for all this before anybody thinks I'm using slave labor, but he would have to go get Red Bull and like snacks for the overnight. He'd have to have a spot set up where we were comfortable and could argue. He would have veto powers at say like 5 a.m. when I'm like arguing with myself and want to keep it all in. He'd just say, "Cut all this on Brady. Sorry about that, Wes." And he would just be like, "This is enough on him," and I would just listen. And like we had a whole, and it's really actually I'll give you a quick story. Really cool life full circle moment for me. So the first time I gave Ben a byline and we engaged in exactly what I just told you was the Philly Specials Super Bowl. He uncovered an anecdote in reporting about Nick Foles from Nick's dad that Nick hadn't considered retirement as the vast majority of people who watch football still believe, but he'd actually retired, gone into the mountains, no cell service. On the way down, Andy Reid calls him, the rest is history. He goes back to Kansas City and then moves over. And so this is a good example of like how none of this can be done alone. Like I would hate for it to come across that way. But also like the reward I gave him was not just a byline on the Super Bowl cover, but I said, you can take my next cover, whatever it is, and it was Saquon Barkley. For that story, he learns that Saquon Barkley, his primary hero growing up was Curtis Martin. I know Curtis Martin. I boxed with Curtis Martin for a story when I was at the New York Times. He couldn't throw any punches, just to make that clear, if not already. Probably is already. And I set up Saquon to play chess with Curtis Martin. Now, about 6 weeks ago, I realized the Eagles are going to go. Like it seems really clear at that point. And I say, what am I weak on? And right away I say, I don't have anything on Saquon Barkley. I don't know anybody in the circle. I didn't really see this coming. I did zero reporting on his time in New York. So naturally, I thought of Ben Baskin, his reporting file for the Saquon cover. I taught him how to do these things, helped him refine his process. He sends the file. It's gold. It's got contact for everybody. It's exactly what I taught him and way better because he's not as scattered of human being as I am. So anyway, I sit down with Saquon Barkley 2 days before they fly to New Orleans. It's in an office in Philadelphia. The PR guy tells him before the interview that I am to be trusted, which is cool. Like that means they know that my work, that the interview will be long, and that he can cut it off at any point, which is like what I never want to hear. And I just said to Saquon, "Can I blow your mind for 30 seconds?" And so I grabbed my laptop, opened it, and I started reading him stuff he said in 2018. And all of it was really meaningful. The stuff about wanting the kind of season and career he had in the last year, has additional meaning for all that he fought through, which led to natural openings in the conversation to look back at some stuff. Also, he was saying stuff at the time like, it's going to be so great if I end up in New York. And so then you have the contrast, and that's an easy way to get into the Giants stuff and how bad it was there. Anyway, him and I became like friendly out of it. We talked for 46 minutes, and now I hope he's our preview cover because I used a fraction of our discussion in that thing. And for me, it's one thing that I think is sad about modern journalism. This story I just told you is like, that's the way it's supposed to work. You're supposed to develop sources and go back to them. You're supposed to develop people like your own kind of pod within these organizations. And you don't want them to be your assistant. You want them to star and shine. And we just don't really have that anymore. Mostly I'm telling kids like, are you sure you want to do this? And, I guess part of me though is really grateful that I got a taste of the end of what was really good.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. Greg, what can you tell us? What works can we expect to come out for Greg Bishop soon? What do you have going on right now? What are you working on? And what have we got to look forward to? I know already one that I'm very interested in, but
Yeah, well, I don't have anything cooking for SI beyond a long story that will take me too much time to explain. But I'm happy to come back on when it comes out. Anyway,
Absolutely.
the museum is called the Hall of Excellence. It will be inside the Fontainebleau, Las Vegas, like near all the high-end shops. We've toured the space and it's really come together. One cool side note there, they actually build out the like shell for where the case goes. Then the case itself is built overseas and then it's shipped here and slotted in, which I thought
Wow.
was really wild, like a
Yeah.
puzzle piece. It's scheduled to open in May, and I wouldn't have maybe said this a week ago, but I think it's going to open on time. We've made a lot of progress in the last week. Let's see what else. The announcement for the Mike Tyson documentary about it being on Netflix, that should probably take like a year, but we're getting started on that. Then I have several other documentary projects in the works. One involves Jim Trier, the Kansas City Chief, who almost got in the Hall of Fame a month ago. Reason he's not in the Hall of Fame because he's the single best player who's not in is because after retiring, he went into a steep, dramatic decline, murder suicide with the wife. Kids have forgiven him and pushed for his candidacy, so that story's about the arc of forgiveness. Got something cooking on the original Iron Man that I really love. We forget that they wore jean shorts and drank cokes and stopped at McDonald's, while doing the same like rough version of events. And then yeah, looking forward to getting cranking on the NFL stuff. I have a piece in the current issue on Lindsey Vaughn, Super Bowl cover from the last one, and yeah, at this point in time in journalism, I'm incredibly grateful for one viewer or one reader. Like everybody's going to take the time to consume the monsters I put together. I would hug you if I could. Thank you.
Oh, Greg, I know we're gonna get into Tom Brady in a second, but then he's already itching. But I do have to ask you, you're very objective in a lot of your writing just because of reporting natural things. But I do want your opinion on one thing. You're a Seattle guy, and I think you might know what I'm about to ask you.
I'm curious.
If you have Marshawn Lynch in your backfield, what are you doing if you're on the 1 yard line?
Well, I mean, I think the answer is obvious, and I would say the answer I would use is the one he told me directly. So I've written about this play far more than I ever wanted to, but I also think I understand the relevance, right? And people here love it, and I love going to the radio afterward. But a few years back, I did like a retrospective, and I got Marshawn. Funny side note story: interview was over Zoom. He's smoking what looks like a joint the whole time. I lived in Seattle. I don't have any qualms with that, but I didn't want to like ask him and seem like super old, middle-aged white guy. And so afterward, I text the publicist who has been his person for a long time and said, is it okay if I put that he was smoking a joint in there? And do you know like what strain or like even if it's sativa or indica? And she goes, I knew you were going to ask that. It's a champagne flavored black and mild. And so anyway, I was able to use that in the story. And he said he was confused. He said he should have gotten the ball. And he said Pete Carroll lost that team and unraveled the dynasty with one meeting, which was the first one after they came back. And I like Pete and have written a lot about him, but I agree with Marshawn here because most of his teammates felt the same way. To me, Pete Carroll unraveled that dynasty in that very first meeting when a group of people he had taught to be accountable beyond anything else heard him not take accountability for one of the worst mistakes ever made by a coach in Super Bowl history. And these guys, like, I think that's part of my job and part of his. Like, football players, for all the violence inherent in their sport and the time devoted to athletics, like they can separate who's like coming for something else and who's being real with them, I think, pretty easily. Now, obviously, some have been led into bad financial advice, stuff like that. I think those are mostly people that haven't dealt with those people. But yeah, I mean, part of my job every time I do one of these things, whether it's a museum or the story, is like convincing them that I'm an actual human being who's not there to ask them about their next opponent, their latest ankle injury, or any of the normal stuff that makes me as crazy as it does them.
So, do you call it the tush push or the brotherly shove?
I love these. We're hitting all stuff I've done. I wrote about this 2 years ago. I'm currently doing something on the side with the Scottish rugby consultant who helped the Eagles turn this play into what it is. And it started with being connected to him during that story process. Uh, I actually suggested something in the story that caught on not at all, but I think it's the best, which is, I mean, a Seattle guy here. So my suggestion was Baby Got Backed, ED.
I love it.
Well, I forget who it was because there is rumors they're trying to ban this play, and I forgot who it was that said it. I saw it on a video yesterday, the day before, but they said it is a tough play to actually run. Like they practice it a lot. Like it's a very tough, and people think it's easy, and they're like, well, should you ban a guy like Jamar Chase who can catch the long ball better than anybody, or like AJ Brown who can catch a deep ball? And so I thought that brought up a great point because I think everybody thinks it's just this easy play, but it's daunting, and they practice it a lot. So
100%. A few things I'd mention there. One is the story I did was after the first season. If people want to find it, they can just search me and Tush Push and SI. In there, the Scottish rugby consultant says it's not really a rugby play the way most people have built it. The principles are very different. The part that he taught the Eagles that he still has never told me about is how to do the hand-to-hand combat in the trench. So that's a competitive advantage earned through actual insight and hard work, in my opinion. The other thing that I wrote about in there is Jalen's tush is particularly wide and presents a good target for his offensive, for the guys behind him. Also a competitive advantage that's not born just from trickery. And, they had at the time Jason Kelce, maybe the best center in the history of the NFL, who took those principles and the tush behind him that made it elevated. And I think it's silly they're trying to ban it. In that story, I talked to Dante Scarnecchia, who, Brady he was telling me Brady would pick a gap and then he'd go to that gap, but they understood like his read was what mattered within that calculus, which is why they did quarterback sneaks at a conversion rate far higher than any other NFL team pre-Tush Push ever. And he basically winds in that piece, as I recall it anyway, to the conclusion of like they invented the best way to do the quarterback sneak, which to me should take it off of any potential ban list. Like it's exactly what you said. If Tyreek Hill beats every defender deep, you don't outlaw that play because he's faster than every other receiver. It's just another competitive advantage. And also to your point, their numbers have gone down just a touch since they lost Kelce, since Jalen got hurt, since they put in a bunch of new linemen. So it's still a devastating play, but you can see the individual impact even of the people involved, which is something they never should look at a ban for at all.
Yeah. Well, Greg, I've always never really known how I felt about fate, but I'm looking back at it now, and I ended up going to Alice Lloyd College. Was an education major for a while, which I didn't end up graduating with, but I met Dr. B, which will in turn lead to this interview. And then we've also been looking for every possible reason for a trip to Vegas, and the museum opening in May might just be it. So if it's not fate, I don't know what.
We'll be.
I'm sure they're looking for coverage. I might even be able to grease the wheels a little bit and get y'all in there. So let's see.
Okay. All right.
We're in. We do live shows, which we could do.
Yeah, there you go.
Which I'm completely jumping tracks here, but Wes, what grade did you get in Dr. B's class?
Oh, good question.
Oh man, I wish you hadn't asked that question. No. I think I ended up with an A in Dr. B's class, but that goes back to Dr. B, man. One of the great things about his class is I don't know that necessarily the grade was important to him, right? Like he wanted you to develop, and so it was like I don't know that you went into that class wondering if you were getting A or a B. You went into that class like being invested. So.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you said that in part because long before any sports team had a process, he was telling me that it didn't matter as much as I thought it did, and that what I needed to focus on was like really learning what I was doing. So yeah, thanks, Pops.
Oh, taught you well. It all circling back around. Greg, listen. I want to thank you again for hopping on this podcast. There is a million other questions that I would love to ask you, and hopefully we'll get to at some point in time. I hope this is not our last conversation about sports or life or Dr. B or anything else in that matter. So again, thank you. And I look forward to having another conversation soon.
Thank you very much for having me, both of you. And also, I'd be happy to come back on. You can imagine I do a few thousand of these that are about like which team's going to win on Sunday or who looks the best in the upcoming off season. So when I get to talk about my work, which to me is as meaningful as something can be, and to include my dad in it, like that's really cool. I will come on anytime you ask me to. And if you want to do us both, it might be kind of curious. I honestly
awesome.
don't know what he would say about my career, but it might be kind of interesting.
I think that would be great.
Let's do it.
Awesome. I'll send him this one. He'll like it. And good looking out, Pops, not passing the number along. Keep that up.
Absolutely. Well, we're actually about to go do a pregame show for the Kentucky-Oklahoma game tonight, live at a restaurant in downtown Lex. So we're open for business. If you need anybody at the museum or anywhere else, you know where to find us.
I love it. Thanks for having me.
All right.
Thanks, Greg.
Thanks.
You know the drill with Wes Smith. Wes Smith. Presented by MCHC.